Alright, so this is the final working session. You can see that I have a session of Q Tractor open with the there's data here in the MIDI sequencer. And then I also have on a split screen, on a second screen, I have my LMMS opened with my instrument plugins all set up, mostly sound fonts. There's some synthesizers in there as well. And then I have my video, XJDO video player, which is scalable and sits on top, and I can move that anywhere I want. It sits nice over here, some space on the screen to just leave it up all the time. Very quickly, let me explain what's going on here. I have on the top, as we discussed already, the background sound effect track here, just for reference, that I have muted. I can turn that on so I can hear what that sounds like against the music and make musical decisions based on the soundtrack that's there, the sound effects. Then I have a grouping here of string instruments, and you can see those are in the first few slots over here. They are interspersed a little bit. There's another string group down here on the LMMS platform. Then I've got a piano. This is a muted piano sound font that I created, put together, and have shared on my channel here, and I have that in here as well, muted piano. And then I have a couple of percussion sets. One is just like a setup for percussion sounds that are not drum set. So these would be more like the Latin type percussion instruments that you're hearing in there. And then another set of percussion. It's actually using the same sound font, the same setup, but we're using different sounds, so I separated them out. This is a drum kit setup. This is just for the drum set, and that's over here. Each one of those is accounted for in separate sound font instances. And then I have a distortion guitar. I have all of my synthesizer type sounds put together here in the pink. And this is color coded. You can change the color of the tracks. There's a distortion guitar. There's a bass boost. This is a sine wave that I use on the big kind of open section here where everything's playing out full, just to give a little bit more of a rich tone to it. To fill out frequencies that are not otherwise occupied. I have a couple of other synthesizers here that work together to make a kind of a bubbly percussive synth sound. This one is called Bubble Synth Carrier, and this is sending information to carrier waves, and I account for those in these two wavetable synthesizers over here, rather these two. So there's one carrier here that is a sawtooth, and then another carrier that is noise, and then these go together down to a channel down here dedicated to them to mix together. And then I have another channel, here's the carry channel. Then I have another one called Bubsynth, and that is actually this one down here that has an envelope, a volume envelope. This is world percussion sounds, and I've sequenced together this little beat. And that goes into another channel down here. Now you'll notice that these are panned all the way to the left for the percussion set, all the way to the right for the carrier waveforms, and that's how the vocoder works in LMMS. So these two channels then feed to the vocoder, and the vocoder takes that information, these are the controls for the vocoder, takes that information and then puts it together and makes this kind of bubble synth sound where the percussive sounds are driving the carrier waveforms. This is a pretty good vocoder. I saw on a tutorial about the LMMS vocoder some time ago some complaints about how inadequate the LMMS vocoder is. It's actually quite good. There's 16 bands of control here that you can EQ, set the levels on, and get various different sounds. Not to mention you have an unlimited choice of what type of carrier sounds and also controlling sounds that you're using. So it's actually a pretty good vocoder if you know how to use it. So the way I have this set up here is the only place I'm using a volume envelope. This volume envelope is tied over here to the world percussion, and that will actually change over the duration to cause a fade-out effect. As you take away either the carrier or the controlling waveform, it will fade out. You don't have to fade both. You just have to fade one, and the vocoder sound will disappear. So I do have a controller running that. So there's automation here using volume envelope that is controlling the volume on that percussion instrument over here. So you can do that. And you could do that with all these channels, assign them to run automation from Q-Tractor into the LMMS controls. Let's see, down here I have a reverse cymbal I use for a couple of transitional moments, and then another synthesizer down here. This is actually a Zened Sub Effects preset, Ancient Echoes. It just makes kind of a transitional sort of atmospheric sound that I use in a couple of places to get from one place to the other. So that's pretty much it. Now I can play by selecting any one of these tracks. I can play into my MIDI keyboard, and I'll hear the output in LMMS, and that is fed back to Q-Tractor, as we discussed already, to the mixer. So that's coming into the master, and the master is set to monitor inputs coming from LMMS. So again, if I play on that, you can see the MIDI data going out for that instrument. You can see that it's going out to the bus, and then it's coming back in as audio from LMMS into the master input. So that's how this all mixes down. Now, if you look at the mixing setup, I'm actually mixing in LMMS. I'm not mixing much in Q-Tractor, except for that one envelope that I've applied down here. I've set all of my volume knobs to where I want them to be, and I'm not automating anything. I've just left them alone. On this session, I don't have to do that. I could automate it if I want to. But everything is pretty much set to go, including the channels that we're feeding down to. Now, each one of these channels represents sort of a subdivision or a section. So I have all of my strings coming into this channel, and I have a reverb applied to that is appropriate to the space where I want those sounds to be. So it's a kind of a moderate-sized room with the wet and dry mixed proportionally about here. Now if I take a look at my auxiliary channel, this is for the pianos and maybe some of the percussion stuff, and I take a look at my reverb setup for that, you can see it's slightly different. It's just a little bit less, the smaller room size, so a little bit more of an intimate sound. Then my percussion is, of course, a different setup from those. A bigger room, but very similar ratio of wet and dry. And then the drum kit has its own, plus I've applied an EQ to the drum kit to give it a little bit of a bigger sound. I boosted some of the bass sounds on that, as I recall. Drum kit, smaller room size, and more dry than wet. A little bit more dry sound on that one. So what you can do is you can set your effects per channel to get the appropriate mix that you want. Also on some of these instruments I've applied effects to the instruments themselves. So for example, if I go to the solo violin and I look at the effects, so nothing on that one. Let me see down here. Section. So there's a stereo enhancer effect that I've applied and some EQ that I've applied to different things to get just the right sound. And I think this is important before you go into mastering, that you get your mix such that you only have to do a few things in mastering, just a few things dealing with compression maybe, and maybe just a slight EQ filter, but otherwise you don't want to be heavily processing your final output. You should do most of that preparation in the mix itself and get a really good mix. So I put a lot of detail into the setup here to get the sound that I wanted. So anyway, this is it, and we can play back from here. Now, I'd have down here a channel for recording. I have it muted right now because I've already recorded it. As I made the movie already, and I'll discuss this here in a second, but I just want you to see the playback. So I have my sound effects muted up here. I could turn those on if I want to hear what's going on in the scene. I'll turn it on for right now, and we'll move our playhead back here, and we'll just hit play and see how this all works together. So we should hear the alarm beeps when we get up to this point. And then you can hear that, and everything syncs perfectly in XJDO, and my sequence is playing back. The MIDI data is feeding from Q-Tractor to LMMS LMMS is then feeding down to the mixing console here, and then the mixer master is coming back to Q Tractor into this master input. And in all of these, you want to make sure that nothing is peaking. You're keeping the levels kind of down in the mid-range so that you can have some room to do some mastering later and normalize everything. You also don't want it too low because you want to have a good contrast of definition to work with. Very quickly, I'll take a look at the, just to show you the inputs and outputs here. So Q Tractor is going to LMMS all of the MIDI channels. My bus is connected to them. And then my MIDI keyboard is going to Q Tractor. I'll stop right here. We'll kill all the sounds over there by hitting play and stop. That ends all the MIDI events in LMMS. You see my MIDI keyboard is connected to the LMMS bus, so that whenever I select a channel over here, my MIDI keyboard will control that MIDI channel and then subsequently that instrument in LMMS. On the audio side, this looks a little more convoluted than it normally would be, and that's because I'm recording a tutorial. I'm having to feed everything through the Pulse audio jack source so that I can record that sound with my screen capture software. Otherwise, this is really a non-issue. You wouldn't be putting anything into that. I also have microphones turned on. Now normally I wouldn't unplug the microphones here. What I would do is I would go to the sound card settings and I would just disable the input device because I don't want to be picking up mic sounds, internal mics, external mics, or hidden mics or anything like that. So I would just turn that off in the sound card rather than unplugging and plugging things in over here. And then if I want the mic, I just make sure I turn it on the sound card and then I can check my plugs. But I'm capturing from microphone and I'm trying to pick up all the Q Tractor output through the Pulse audio jack. Otherwise, this is, again, not part of the setup. What you do want is you want LMMS to be feeding the master out to the master in Q Tractor, and then you want Q Tractor master outs to be feeding back to the system to play out to speakers. And that's pretty much what you want there as a setup. You do not want LMMS to be feeding to the system playback. You don't want to be bypassing Q Tractor. You want everything to come through Q Tractor so that what you hear is what is really in the mix. You also want to avoid loops. So if you're looking at Q Tractor's mixer very quickly, you want to make sure, and actually right now we're probably picking up some loops because of the way we have this set up. But you usually want to make sure that you don't have anything feeding back around into the mixer itself. Actually, we should be okay because the master in is not kicking into the master, or rather the master out is not kicking back into the master in. Now, for recording, we have the potential to create a loop. You can see that I created an audio channel down here, and this is for bouncing out everything up here down into one track and to record it. Q Tractor cannot export everything in an automated way when you're using an external instrument platform. If you're using the plugins internally, it can do that, but again, it's very buggy and you might run into some crashes. This is a much more stable way to do it. If you find that the system resources are not robust enough to run a large session of LMMS or multiple sessions, you may consider bouncing out using this method sections at a time and then mixing the audio tracks that you've bounced out separately in a session of Q Tractor. That's also a possibility too. I find that on my computers I'm able to run a couple of different LMMS sessions and I never run out of memory. It seems to be okay. But you would enable this to record. I have it set to mute right now, and I'm actually going to delete this track. I already have it, or I've already used it. And then I'm going to arm Q Tractor to record. And if we look at the mixer very quickly, on this track, we want to make sure we set it to monitor, and we're going to take the fader and drop it all the way to the bottom. And the reason is because we're only picking up input. We do not want the output of this channel to be going to the mix out, because we already have the mix out coming in. We're monitoring the mix down through the master out. Okay, so we have the master out is coming in, we're monitoring it for recording, and we do not want that to be looping back around. So we take the fader, drop it all the way to the bottom, and then we're set to record. So at this point, we could set our playhead and then record. So I would mute this. We don't want the sound effects sounds in there, and then we would hit play and run it. So it should not record anything down here, including my voice, because I don't have my voice coming into the input in Q Tractor. And then the music starts, and it would then record that. So this would go along. You can see the waveform filling in there. And once we get to the end of that track, we could then stop the recording. I'll very quickly kill the signals over there by hitting play and stop. There is no kill button in LMMS to stop all MIDI events, so you just have to hit play and then stop, and you'll stop everything over there. I found that hitting the kill, the stop events over here in Q Tractor does not stop every MIDI event that is started in LMMS, so you do need to play that little trick over here to stop all the events. Now we have a file down here to work with. Now if I hover over this, it should give me a file name. So this is the meeting mixdown 8, and that would be in the project folder. What I would do is I would go make a copy of that WAV file that it has created, and then I would use that copy for my final mastering in Audacity, which we will look at next. So you can either master in Audacity, or if you have multiple other elements put together, you could do a further mix down in Q Tractor. But ultimately, you want to master your music separate before you bring it back into the video project to add it to the video itself. So we will look at that by doing it in Audacity next in this tutorial.